The history of the Jewish people is one of the longest and most complex in the world. It began thousands of years ago and continues to this day, spanning different countries, eras, and cultures. The Jews have lived through the destruction of temples, exiles, life in dispersion, persecution, and wars. They were part of great empires, Egyptian, Persian, Roman, Ottoman, and at the same time often remained on the margins of power, simply trying to survive and pass on their culture. In this lecture, we'll go through all the key stages of Jewish history, from the ancient Near East and biblical times to modern events. We'll look at how relations with different peoples developed, how life changed across countries, and what helped this people preserve their identity. The history of the Jewish people does not begin with kings or armies, but with a single man, a nomad named Abraham. It is with him that the idea of a covenant with one God begins, an idea that would become central in Judaism and later in other world religions. Abraham is considered the patriarch of the Jewish people, but more importantly, he is a figure of transition between two worlds, the world of the ancient Near East, filled with many gods, and a new idea, the belief in a single, invisible, yet all-powerful Creator. His story begins in the city of Ur, in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq. The Bible refers to it as Ur of the Chaldeans, though this is a later designation. The Chaldeans only appeared in that region centuries after Abraham's time. Nonetheless, in the 20th to 19th centuries BC, the city of Ur was indeed one of the largest and most advanced in Mesopotamia, a wealthy cultural center with temple ziggurats, clay tablets, trade, and noble houses. The main god of the city was Nana, the moon god, and the great temple complex was dedicated to him. According to the biblical account, Abraham, then still called Abram, was born into this world in the family of Terah. His family likely belonged to Western Semitic, nomadic, or semi-nomadic tribes, possibly ancestors of the Arameans or Amorites. Later, according to the text, the family moved to Haran, a city in northern Mesopotamia, and from there, by God's command, Abraham set out for the land of Canaan. This migration was not just a geographic move, but a symbolic break with the previous cultural and religious tradition. He left behind a well-developed but polytheistic civilization and moved toward sparsely populated, scattered lands inhabited by Canaanite tribes. Archaeological data confirm that at this time, Canaan was dotted with small city-states, often under the influence of Egypt or Mesopotamia. The people of those lands worshipped many gods, Baal, Asherah, Moloch, and each city had its own deity, whose cult was maintained by priests. Abraham came there as a patriarch, the head of a clan, a livestock herder, a man without land, but with faith. He did not found a state, did not build temples, did not conquer territory. Instead, he brought with him the idea of a new, invisible God, one who could speak with a person, make a covenant, and be followed voluntarily. Abraham's God was not tied to any place. He was present everywhere and spoke directly. According to the Bible, God made a covenant with Abraham, a promise of numerous descendants and land in return for loyalty. The sign of this covenant became circumcision, a ritual that from then on would become a permanent part of Jewish tradition. After the covenant, Abraham receives a new name, Abraham, which in ancient Hebrew means father of many. What is especially important is that Abraham's religion is based not on rituals and offerings, but on trust. This marks a spiritual shift, away from serving gods through sacrifices and temple rites, toward a personal relationship with one God. This becomes the foundation of a new kind of religious thinking that would later develop in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Abraham does not become a king. He does not write laws. He does not build temples. But his lineage continues. From him comes Isaac, then Jacob, who receives the new name Israel, and his 12 sons, the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. In a broader historical context, the 18th century BC was indeed a time of major change in the ancient Near East. The old Sumerian cities were declining. Amorite dynasties were rising, including Hammurabi in Babylon, and Egypt was gradually extending its influence into the land of Canaan. Nomadic tribes were actively moving in search of pasture, safety, and trade routes. Therefore, Abraham's migration to Canaan fits well into the overall historical landscape of the time. It is historically plausible, though many of the specific details remain a matter of faith and religious tradition. Thus begins the history of the Jewish people, not with a sword or a crown, but with the faith of one man. His step into the unknown, his trust in the voice of God, becomes the starting point of a civilization that will leave a lasting mark on human history. The journey begun by Abraham did not end with him. He merely laid the foundation for a long chain in which the covenant with God was passed from father to son, from generation to generation. And the first to inherit that legacy was his son Isaac. His birth itself is seen as a miracle. According to biblical tradition, he was born when his mother, Sarah, was already 90 years old. His name, Yitzhak, is connected to laughter, because that's how Sarah reacted, with disbelief and a smile, when she heard the news about her future pregnancy. Isaac did not grow up to be a warrior or hero, but rather a calm and peaceful man. Unlike his father, he made no great journeys and never left the land of Canaan. His life was more settled. He dug wells, interacted peacefully with neighboring tribes, and worked in agriculture and livestock. It was through him that the line of the spiritual covenant continued, quietly, without grand declarations, through faithfulness and consistency. One of the most profound and memorable episodes associated with Isaac is the story of the sacrifice. God commands Abraham to offer his son as a sacrifice. It is a test, one that pushes faith to its limit. But at the very last moment, the sacrifice is stopped. Instead of Isaac, a ram is offered. This scene is often seen as a turning point, a final break with the practice of human sacrifice, which was common in the ancient Near East. The God of Abraham and Isaac is not one who demands blood, but one who demands trust. Isaac has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. The elder Esau is strong and physically capable, a hunter and his father's favorite. The younger Jacob is quiet and thoughtful, more closely attached to his mother. According to the story, Jacob uses cunning to obtain the blessing of the firstborn, which rightfully belonged to Esau. The story is filled with tension and emotion. It's a family drama, a struggle over spiritual inheritance, and a complex relationship between brothers. Afterward, Jacob is forced to leave home and set off on a long journey. During his travels, he has a dream, a ladder reaching to the heavens, with angels ascending and descending. This image becomes a symbol of the connection between the earthly and the divine. And in this dream, he hears for the first time that God will be with him, as he was with his father and grandfather. It is not just reassurance, it is a personal calling, a covenant now addressed to him. Later, in another episode, he wrestles with a mysterious being, an angel or even God himself. After this nighttime struggle, he receives a new name, Israel, which means the one who wrestles with God. This name will later become the name of the entire people. Jacob spends many years in the house of his uncle Laban. There, he marries Laban's 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, and builds a large family. He has 12 sons and 1 daughter. The names of his sons will later become the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. They are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Each of these tribes will eventually become a distinct group with its own territory, history, and traditions. Among all of Jacob's sons, Joseph holds a special place. He is the son of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, and is particularly loved by his father. Jacob gives him a richly ornamented robe, which stirs jealousy among the brothers. Eventually, they cannot stand it any longer, throw him into a pit, and sell him to a passing caravan of traders. They then bring his bloodied robe to their father, claiming Joseph has died. This begins a separate and important story, the story of Joseph in Egypt. There, he goes through many trials, slavery, prison, humiliation. But thanks to his intelligence, wisdom, and gift of interpreting dreams, he rises to a position of power and becomes one of Pharaoh's chief advisors. When famine strikes in Canaan, his brothers come to Egypt seeking food. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. The story unfolds as a tale of reconciliation. Joseph does not seek revenge. He forgives. He reveals his identity and invites his father and entire family to settle in Egypt. Thus, the whole family of Jacob arrives in the land of Egypt, in the region of Goshen. It marks a transition from a nomadic life in Canaan to a settled life in Egypt. This is the beginning of a new chapter, not just a family history, but a national one. And although the Israelites are still living as welcomed guests, not as slaves, there is already a sense that this peace will not last long. Ahead lie new trials, long years of bondage, and a rebellion led by a man named Moses. It is important to imagine the world in which the patriarchs lived. What was happening in the lands of Mesopotamia and Canaan? What everyday life looked like, which cultures existed, and which peoples these nomadic tribes might have encountered. Archaeology and historical sources allow us to partially reconstruct this picture. The period traditionally associated with the era of the patriarchs, roughly from the 20th to the 16th century BC, was a time when the main centers of civilization in the Near East were Mesopotamia and Egypt. Between them, at the crossroads of cultures and trade routes, lay Canaan, a fragmented but strategically important region connecting north and south, desert and fertile valleys. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is modern-day Iraq. In its southern part stood the city of Ur, one of the oldest and most developed centers of its time. Its ziggurat, a temple to the moon god, still rises above the sands. In the 20th century, archaeologists led by Leonard Woolley excavated the city and uncovered an advanced system of canals, royal tombs, gold, and lapis lazuli ornaments, all evidence of a high culture and organized urban life. According to the biblical account, Abraham came from this world, a man who left the center of civilization and set out for a wild and yet undeveloped land. Further north, in the area between Mesopotamia and Canaan, was Haran, mentioned in the biblical text as a stop along Abraham's family's journey. Haran truly existed and was known as a major center of trade and moon god worship, just like Ur. It was located at the junction of caravan routes and played an important role in the exchange between regions. Moving further south, we reach Canaan. This land was not a unified state, but a mosaic of small city-states, tribal alliances, and rural settlements. Each city had its local deity, its elite, and its customs. The Canaanites built stone fortifications, practiced agriculture, grew grapes, olives, and grain, and herded livestock. Archaeological excavations in places such as Lachish, Megiddo, Hazor, and Shechem show that this region had well-developed cities already in the 18th to 16th centuries BC. Temples, storehouses, palaces, and clay tablets with writing have been found, indicating a relatively advanced and literate culture. However, alongside these cities, nomadic tribes also lived in the land, the Amorites, whose tents archaeologists have identified in settlement layers from the period. Like the figures of biblical narratives, they moved from place to place, searched for water and pastures, maintained family lineages, and preserved tradition through oral storytelling. It is important to understand that what is described in the Bible cannot always be confirmed literally by archaeology. But overall, the way of life of the patriarchs, as nomadic shepherds living on the border between settled cities and wilderness, fits well with the realities of that era. Historians refer to such groups as Semitic nomads. They lived on the fringes of major civilizations, sometimes serving as mercenaries, sometimes as traders, and sometimes simply trying to survive in difficult conditions. Another important source of evidence comes from texts found outside of Israel. Among them are the so-called Mari archives, discovered in the city of Mari on the Euphrates. These letters, dating to around the 18th century BC, mention nomadic groups with names strikingly similar to those in the Bible, including words like Benjamin and Jacob-el. These are not direct proofs, but they are important clues. The names and ways of life described in the Bible were known in the wider region. Thus, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob fit into the historical context of the ancient Near East as the story of a small family living in the shadow of great powers, Egypt, Babylon, the Sumerians, and the Hittites. According to the Bible, the Israelites settled in the region of Goshen, in the eastern Nile Delta, and at first lived there freely, as respected relatives of Joseph, one of the most important men in the country. However, over time, the situation changed, and potentially dangerous people, numerous, separate, and not Egyptian in culture or faith. From a historical perspective, it is difficult to date these events precisely. Some scholars believe that the presence of the Hebrews in Egypt may be connected with the period of the Hyksos, Semitic rulers who took control of Egypt around the 17th century BC. It is possible that the Israelites were part of a broader wave of Semitic migration into Egypt during that time. But when the Hyksos were overthrown and native Egyptian rule was re-established, attitudes toward Semitic peoples sharply worsened. This may have been the beginning of oppression. The Bible says the Israelites were forced into hard labor. They built the cities of Pithom and Ramses, made bricks from clay and straw, and worked under supervision. Their lives grew increasingly difficult, but the more they were oppressed, the more their numbers grew. Then Pharaoh issued a cruel decree. All newborn Hebrew boys were to be killed. It is during this time that Moses is born. According to tradition, to save him from death, his mother places the baby in a basket sealed with pitch and sets it afloat on the Nile. The basket is found by Pharaoh's daughter, who, unaware of his origin, adopts the child as her own. Thus, Moses is raised at the heart of Egyptian power, grows up at the royal court, receives an education, and learns the language, culture, and structure of the country. As he matures, he witnesses injustice. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and unable to contain himself, kills the oppressor. After this, he is forced to flee Egypt and spends many years in the wilderness, in the land of Midian. There, he begins a new life, tending sheep, getting married, and distancing himself from his former world. But one day, everything changes. Moses sees a burning bush that is not consumed by the fire. From within the flames, God speaks to him and says, "I am that I am. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." This becomes a turning point, not only in Moses' life, but in the entire history of Israel. Moses hesitates. He says he cannot speak well, that he is not the right person for the task. But God promises to be with him. He is given signs and help, including his brother Aaron, who will speak on his behalf. Moses returns to Egypt, not as a fugitive, but as God's messenger, with a demand to let the Israelite people go. This marks the beginning of a confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh, between the idea of freedom and the power of empire. Ahead lie the 10 plagues, the Exodus, the desert, Mount Sinai, and the covenant. But already at this stage, Moses becomes a central figure, a leader, a prophet, a mediator between God and the people, a man who will lead the escape from slavery and begin the journey toward freedom. After the exodus from Egypt, the Israelites found themselves in the desert. They were no longer slaves, but they had not yet become a people in the full sense of the word. They had no land, no legal system, no shared code of norms. They were descendants of a single patriarch, but now they had to become something more, a community united not only by blood ties, but also by shared values. It was here, at Mount Sinai, that an event occurred which would change them forever. According to tradition, this is where Moses received the Torah, the teaching, the law, the covenant. The word Torah in Hebrew means not so much law as instruction or guidance. It is not just a set of rules. It is the foundation of the entire Jewish tradition, the spiritual axis on which not only religion, but also way of life, thinking, and culture would be built. The receiving of the Torah is seen as the moment of the birth of the people of Israel, not just as a tribe, but as a people of the covenant. The climax of this revelation is the 10 Commandments, a brief but remarkably rich text given by God to Moses. According to the biblical description, the commandments were inscribed on 2 stone tablets and given directly from God. These words became the first and perhaps the most well-known expression of monotheistic morality. They encompass both a person's relationship with God and their relationship with others. The first commandments relate to faith. "I am the Lord your God. Do not make for yourself an idol. Do not take the name of God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day. The rest are the basis of social ethics. Honor your father and mother. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not covet. It is important to understand that in the ancient world, laws came from kings. Pharaohs, Babylonian rulers, Hittite kings, all of them established rules, legitimizing them through their power. But here, it is not a king, but God, not for the elite, but for everyone. This is a radically new idea. The law does not belong to the palace, but to the people. It must be followed not out of fear of a ruler, but out of a sense of duty, conscience, and inner loyalty. The Torah became not just a religious document, but the foundation of a culture passed down from generation to generation. It was studied, discussed, copied. It includes not only commandments, but also history, parables, poetry, and detailed descriptions of daily life and rituals. It is a book that preserves not only laws, but a path, the path of a people from slavery to freedom, from chaos to structure, from tribe to nation. From a historical perspective, the significance of the Torah and the Ten Commandments goes far beyond Israel itself. These ideas became the foundation of Christianity and Islam, influenced the European legal tradition, and shaped concepts of justice, freedom, and personal responsibility. Even in secular society, the principles set forth in the Torah still resonate as an integral part of civilization's cultural code. For the Jewish people, the Torah is not just a book. It is a living presence. It was read in synagogues, passed down orally, and became part of prayers, debates, and study. Even in the harshest conditions, in exile, in ghettos, in deportation, Torah scrolls were guarded as the most precious possession. Because within it is not just law, within it is meaning. Archaeology began systematically studying the Bible in the 19th century, when the first expeditions to Egypt, Palestine, and Mesopotamia took place. Cities mentioned in biblical texts were discovered, as well as inscriptions, clay tablets, and temple ruins. All of this confirmed many details, from geography to customs, but it also became clear that biblical history does not always align with the archaeological record. Some events, especially the most ancient ones, cannot be confirmed. The figures of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are not documented in inscriptions of that time. There are no references to these individuals in the royal archives of the Sumerians, Egyptians, or Hittites. Their names do not appear on cuneiform tablets, and no tombs or settlements have been found that can be confidently linked to them. However, this does not necessarily mean they were fictional. It is likely they lived during an era when writing had not yet reached nomadic tribes, and memory was passed down orally, through stories, genealogies, and traditions. The story of Joseph and his life in Egypt is one of the most dramatic episodes in the Bible. Some scholars have suggested it may be connected to the Hyksos period, when Semitic rulers controlled parts of Egypt in the 17th, 16th centuries BC. During that time, groups of Semitic origin were indeed migrating into Egypt. It is possible that a memory of a high-ranking foreigner who rose to power at the pharaoh's court was preserved from that period, but there is no direct archaeological evidence for the historical figure of Joseph. The Exodus remains a separate and highly debated topic, the account of how Moses led the people out of slavery. This is a central event in the Tanakh and Jewish tradition, yet Egyptian sources say nothing about a mass escape of Semitic slaves. Egyptian records, especially during the New Kingdom, are detailed and extensive, but they make no mention of Moses or the Exodus. Archaeology also does not provide clear confirmation. On the Sinai Peninsula, where according to the Bible, the Israelites spent 40 years, no traces have been found of large camps, settlements, or mass migration. This leads many scholars to view the story as a symbolic or literary reflection of real historical experiences. At the same time, Egyptian texts do refer to foreigners from the East, Semitic people who lived, worked, and fought in Egypt. There are mentions of uprisings, migrations, and conflicts with nomadic tribes. It is possible that the biblical Exodus is a collective memory of various migrations, escapes, and disasters, later woven into a unified narrative of miraculous deliverance. The situation with Mount Sinai also remains uncertain. Archaeology cannot definitively identify its location. Various sites have been proposed, from the traditional Jebel Musa in the southern Sinai Peninsula to locations in northwestern Arabia. None of these places show conclusive archaeological evidence of large human encampments. It's possible that we should not be looking for literal confirmation at all. In ancient tradition, numbers and images often carried symbolic meaning. 40 years may have meant a generation, rather than a precise chronological duration. Today, most historians and archaeologists believe that the stories of the patriarchs, the slavery in Egypt, and the Exodus are not documentary records, but expressions of collective memory. These are spiritual and cultural narratives that reflect an inner history, the story of a people's formation, its faith, and its relationship with God. These stories shaped identity, inspired survival, and helped explain both suffering and hope. Biblical texts remain unique. Even without complete archaeological verification, they hold immense historical value as reflections of how ancient people thought, felt, and understood the world. They combine elements of myth, religion, poetry, and shared memory, and that is why they are still studied, read, and debated today, because they speak not only about the past, but about how people remember, what they believe in, and who they strive to become. After the Israelites left Egypt, received the Torah, and spent 40 years in the wilderness, they entered the land of Canaan. This marked the beginning of a long and complex process, settling the land, encountering local tribes, struggling for survival, and preserving their faith. At first, they had no centralized authority. Each tribe lived independently, uniting only in times of external threat. The land was governed by judges, charismatic leaders such as Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. It was a period of instability, internal conflicts, and temporary alliances. Over time, the people began to ask for a king, someone who could unite the tribes, establish order, and become a visible leader. This was not a simple request. As previously, it was believed that only God should rule the people. But the prophet Samuel, the last of the judges, eventually anointed the first king at the people's insistence, Saul. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. He was tall, strong, and charismatic, and at first, he earned the people's respect by defeating enemies, strengthening the army, and restoring order. But over time, his rule became unstable. He began to act against the prophet's guidance, grew anxious and suspicious, and seemed to lose touch with reality. Samuel rejected him as king and secretly anointed a new ruler, a young shepherd from the tribe of Judah named David. David's story is one of rising from obscurity. He defeated Goliath, became a national hero, entered the royal court, and married Saul's daughter. But David's growing fame provoked jealousy, and he was forced to flee. For years, he lived in hiding, gathered loyal followers, survived in the wilderness, and endured hardship. Despite having chances to overthrow Saul, David refused to harm him. He respected divine order and believed in God's will. After Saul's death in battle, David was first made king over Judah and later over all the tribes of Israel. He chose Jerusalem as his capital, a city that had previously belonged to the Jebusites, and transformed it into both a political and spiritual center. It was there that he brought the Ark of the Covenant. From that moment on, Jerusalem became a symbol of holiness and the heart of Jewish tradition. However, David's reign was not without faults. He committed a serious moral transgression. Falling in love with the wife of one of his soldiers, he arranged for the man's death in battle. This act brought turmoil to his own family. One of his sons assaulted his sister, another avenged her by killing the brother, and a third, Absalom, led a rebellion. David put down the revolt, but lost his son and was consumed by grief. His inner struggles are reflected in the Psalms attributed to him. In those verses, we hear a voice of repentance, sorrow, and faith. After David's death, his son Solomon became king. Solomon is remembered as a wise and peaceful ruler who strengthened the kingdom. Under his reign, Israel reached its greatest power and prosperity. He forged alliances with other nations, expanded trade, and received envoys from distant lands. His greatest achievement was the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. This temple became the center of religious life, the place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, a symbol of the covenant with God and the ongoing presence of holiness in the life of the people. Yet Solomon, despite his glory, strayed from the path toward the end of his life. He entered into many marriages with women from foreign nations, and under their influence began building altars to other gods. This provoked discontent and weakened the kingdom. After his death, the united monarchy split into two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Thus ended the era of the united monarchy. It was short but significant. It was a time when the Jewish people had a shared land, a capital, a temple, a king, and a sense of unity. Despite internal conflicts and moral failures, this period gave birth to enduring symbols that remained in the collective memory of the nation. David as the ideal king, Jerusalem as the holy city, and the temple as the house of God. After the death of King Solomon, around 930 BCE, it was not an era of continued greatness that followed, but a time of growing tension. The great united kingdom, built through Solomon's wisdom and labor, proved to be quite vulnerable. People had grown weary of heavy taxes, forced labor, the luxury of the royal court, and the numerous foreign alliances Solomon had made toward the end of his reign. When his son Rehoboam ascended the throne, many hoped he would ease the burdens and rule with justice. Representatives of the northern tribes came to him with a request to lighten the yoke they had borne under his father. But Rehoboam, ignoring the advice of the elders, chose a path of harshness. He declared that he would rule even more strictly than Solomon. His words alienated the people. In response, 10 northern tribes refused to recognize his authority. They proclaimed Jeroboam, a man of the people who had once served under Solomon, but later fell from favor as their king. Thus, the kingdom was divided. In the north arose the kingdom of Israel, with its first capital in Shechem and later in Samaria. In the south remained the kingdom of Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem and a dynasty descending from David. This was a turning point. Israel, the northern kingdom, was larger in both population and territory, but politically unstable. Kings changed frequently, and coups followed one another. To distance the people from Jerusalem and the temple, Jeroboam established his own religious centers in Bethel and Dan. There he placed golden calves, reviving imagery familiar from Egypt. This act was condemned by the prophets, as it violated the very essence of belief in one God. The southern kingdom of Judah was smaller, but the Davidic dynasty remained uninterrupted. Its main sanctuary continued to be Solomon's temple. Although foreign cults occasionally gained influence, especially during times of political weakness, Judah remained closely tied to Jerusalem as its spiritual center. The two kingdoms coexisted, sometimes forming alliances, sometimes engaging in conflict. External threats grew increasingly serious. New powers emerged: Aram, Egypt, and later Assyria, which began to dominate the region. A catastrophe was drawing near, especially for the northern kingdom. Yet, it was during these centuries, beginning in the 10th century BC, and especially in the 8th and 7th centuries, that a profound shift took place. The prophetic tradition emerged. Voices began to speak out, reminding the people that true strength did not lie in walls or kings, but in faithfulness to the covenant. The prophets called for justice, mercy, and inner purity. And even in an age of division and decline, the people began to seek meaning not in statehood, but in a faith that could outlast kingdoms and destruction. In the second half of the 7th century BC, the southern kingdom of Judah found itself in a highly vulnerable position. By that time, the Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the region for a long period, was beginning to collapse. In its place, a new and powerful state emerged, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, with its capital in Babylon. To the south, Egypt remained, trying to maintain its influence over the Levant. Judah, caught between these two powers, found itself in a difficult political situation. Attempts to survive by shifting alliances between Babylon and Egypt led to a series of fatal mistakes. After the death of King Josiah in 609 BC, the country descended into instability. His successors, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah, one after another lost control of the situation. At times, the kings of Judah submitted to Babylon, then rebelled again, hoping for Egypt's support. This became especially dangerous after Nebuchadnezzar firmly established himself as Babylon's ruler. In 597 BC, following the first rebellion, Babylonian forces entered Jerusalem. The city surrendered, and the temple was not destroyed, but the ruling elite, including King Jehoiakim and the prophet Ezekiel, were taken into exile. Zedekiah, the younger son of Josiah, was placed on the throne, but a few years later, he too broke his oath of loyalty and rebelled against Babylon. In 588 BC, the siege of Jerusalem began. For nearly 2 years, the city endured, but amid hunger, fear, and exhaustion, its strength gave out. In 586 BC, the city fell. The Babylonian army tore down the walls, burned homes and palaces, and most importantly, destroyed Solomon's temple. For the people, this was not just the fall of a city. It was the end of the world as they knew it. King Zedekiah was captured. His sons were executed before his eyes, and he was blinded and taken to Babylon. Alongside him, thousands were exiled. It was not the entire population, but it was the cultural, religious, and political elite. Thus began the Babylonian captivity, one of the most difficult periods in Jewish history. For the ancient Israelite, the temple was not just a building. It was the center of life, the place of God's presence. Its destruction felt like the loss of the covenant itself. How could faith continue if the altar was gone? Sacrifices were impossible, the prophet silent, and the people exiled. It was precisely then that a profound internal transformation began. The prophets, especially Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah, began to speak of a God who was not confined to the temple. He was everywhere, even in exile. Along the banks of the Euphrates, a new form of spiritual life emerged. For the first time, the idea took root that God could be found not only in Jerusalem, but in the Word, in the law, in memory. The sacred texts began to be collected and copied. The Word became the new temple. It was during this time that the foundations of Judaism were laid, a form of faith that would continue without a king, without a temple, but with the Torah, with belief, and with hope. The exile lasted for about 50 years. During that time, a new generation grew up, one that had never seen Jerusalem, but knew everything about it. And when, in 538 BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great issued a decree allowing the Jews to return, they set out, not simply back to their homeland, but toward a spiritual renewal. But that is the story of the next chapter. When the exile was over, a new process began, one that proved to be no less difficult than the captivity itself. Those who chose to return to Judah were not walking into a dreamland, but into a land covered in ashes. The city lay in ruins, the fields were overgrown, the roads had vanished, and everything that once connected the people to their homeland had been destroyed. Those who had remained behind were in no hurry to share their land or welcome the former exiles. The first wave of returnees, led by Zerubbabel and the high priest Jeshua, arrived around 537 BC. These people did not bring armies or wealth, but an inner determination. They believed that their mission was not merely to rebuild houses, but to revive the covenant. The top priority was restoring worship. For a people who had lost the temple, the return of sacrifices meant the return of God's presence. Since the temple itself had not yet been rebuilt, the first task was to restore the altar. It became a temporary center of spiritual life. Daily offerings, readings, prayers, all of this began to sound once again in Jerusalem. It was a modest but powerful symbol. Despite everything, the people had returned to God. At the same time, work began to clear the site and prepare for the construction of a new temple. But from the very beginning, everything became complicated. Surrounding Judah were other peoples, Samaritans, Ammonites, Persians, Greeks, and many of them were displeased with the rise of Jewish activity. Provocations, threats, and denunciations to the imperial court began. Under pressure from opponents, construction was halted for nearly 2 decades. These years became a time of doubt. People turned to their fields and homes and abandoned the project. They said, "The time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord." But it was during this time that the prophets Haggai and Zechariah appeared, reminding the people that if the house of God lies in desolation, people themselves cannot be blessed. These prophecies sounded not as condemnation, but as a call to responsibility, to faith, to action. Inspired by this, construction resumed. It was labor under difficult conditions, without political support, without sufficient resources, under constant threat. But step by step, the walls began to rise. In 516 BC, exactly 70 years after the destruction of the first temple, the second temple was completed and consecrated. It was simpler, humbler, without the Ark of the Covenant, without former grandeur, but it existed. And that meant the bond with God was restored. Nearly 50 years later, Ezra arrived in Judah, a scribe well versed in the law of Moses. He came not as a builder, but as a spiritual leader. He saw that rebuilding walls was not enough. The essence of the people needed restoration. He began by gathering the people and reading the Torah aloud, not as a priest, but as a teacher. This was a new experience, to hear the law, to understand its meaning, to apply it in life. The words of the Torah echoed through the square, and the people stood and wept. They realized how far they had strayed from the covenant. But these tears were not of despair. They were a return to themselves. From that moment, a new stage began. Faith became not just a matter of sacrifice, but a matter of understanding, study, memory, and personal choice. Soon after Ezra, Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, a man with administrative talent, an emissary of the Persian king. He took on the task of rebuilding the city walls. He organized labor, defense against enemies, reformed the court and the social order. He was neither priest nor prophet, but his contribution was no less significant. He gave the community structure, stability, and boundaries. Ezra and Nehemiah acted differently, but in harmony. One spoke to the heart, the other with the hands. One appealed to conscience, the other to organization. Together, they transformed a shattered community into a living society. During this period, Judaism fully emerged as a religion of the book. The Torah was no longer just a sacred text, but the foundation of all life. Synagogues arose as places to study the Torah. The tradition of prayer beyond the temple, of study outside Jerusalem, of faith independent of political power, began to take root. After the fall of the Persian Empire, control over Judah passed to new rulers, first to Alexander the Great, and then to his successors. Along with them came a new culture, Greek culture, which spread rapidly throughout the East and left a deep mark even in places untouched by military conquest. In Judah, gymnasiums, theaters, and buildings in the Greek style began to appear. The Greek language became official, and more Jews began to speak it in everyday life. Many were fascinated by this new way of thinking and living. They adopted Greek customs, wore Greek clothing, and gave their children Greek names. Society gradually became divided. Some people wanted to preserve the traditions, while others were drawn to the new, more modern world. At first, this was merely a matter of cultural preference, but over time, the tension grew. The real clash began during the reign of the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes. He decreed that all peoples in his kingdom must live under the same laws and worship the same gods. In Judah, this meant a ban on circumcision, on observing the Sabbath, and on reading the Torah. An altar to Zeus was set up in the Jerusalem temple, and Jewish religious practices were declared legal. This was no longer just a cultural issue. It became the violent suppression of faith. In response, a revolt broke out. It was led by an elderly priest named Mattathias, who lived in the village of Modian. When royal officials came and demanded that he offer a pagan sacrifice, he refused and then took up arms. His sons and others who were ready to defend their faith and way of life followed him into the hills. After Mattathias' death, the uprising was continued by his son Judah, known as Maccabee. The rebels had no strong army, but they knew the terrain well, were well organized, and were prepared to fight. Using surprise attacks, clever tactics, and support from the local population, they were able to defeat Greek garrisons. Their strength lay not in numbers, but in their determination. A few years after the uprising began, the Maccabean forces succeeded in liberating Jerusalem. Their main goal was to purify and restore the temple. They tore down the pagan altars, rebuilt the sacrificial altar, and repaired everything that had been defiled. A day came when the temple was rededicated, and the menorah, the seven-branched lamp, symbol of God's presence, was lit once again. According to tradition, there was only enough oil for the menorah to burn for 1 day, but miraculously the flame burned for 8 days, exactly the time needed to prepare new, pure oil. This moment was seen as a sign from above. In memory of this event, the holiday of Hanukkah was established, the festival of lights, renewal, and steadfast faith, even in the most difficult times. After the temporary independence won by the Maccabees, Judah soon came under the rule of Rome. At first, it was a form of protectorate. The Romans allowed local kings to govern the land as long as they remained loyal. One of these kings was Herod the Great, a talented but ruthless man. He invested enormous resources into the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem, making it the most magnificent in the history of Israel. But at the same time, he was dependent on Rome, and the people did not love him. After Herod's death, and especially during the time of Roman governors, the situation worsened. Brutality, taxes, interference in religious life, constant humiliation from the occupiers, all of this built up over decades. The people were weary. Resistance was growing in minds, in hearts, in synagogues, and in street conversations. In the year 66 of our era, an open rebellion began. In Jerusalem, a revolt was launched. Roman soldiers were expelled, fortresses seized. In the first months, the rebels felt that victory was possible. But the Roman Empire did not forgive defiance. One of its best generals, Vespasian, was sent to crush the uprising. When a power crisis began in Rome, he became emperor himself, and he entrusted the siege of Jerusalem to his son Titus. The Roman legions advanced slowly, but relentlessly through Judah. Many cities were destroyed. The fiercest fighting took place over Jerusalem. In the year 70, the Romans reached the city and began the siege. Inside, it was terrifying. Beyond fear of the enemy, the city was gripped by hunger and internal war. Various Jewish factions, Zealots, Sadducees, and others fought each other. Instead of unity, there was division. There was no bread. People ate grass, leather straps, leftover grain. Disease spread, and hope disappeared. After several months of siege, the Romans broke into the city. The final battle was for the temple. According to various accounts, Titus did not order its destruction, but in the chaos of battle, flames engulfed the building. The temple, built and expanded by Herod, with its white stones and golden vaults, was destroyed. What had survived Babylon did not survive Rome. Only one wall of the temple remained, the support of the outer courtyard. Later, it would be called the Western Wall, and it would become a sacred site of Jewish memory. The city was destroyed. According to various estimates, hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. The survivors were taken into slavery. Some ended up in Rome, where the money from the sale of the temple's treasures was used to build the Colosseum. Not only the army was expelled from Jerusalem, but the very idea that Jews could freely live in their own land. The diaspora began, the scattering. Of course, Jewish communities had existed outside of Judah even earlier, in Egypt, in Babylon, in Asia Minor. But now exile became the fate of the majority. Those who survived settled throughout the Roman Empire, from Syria and the Alexandrian coast to Greece, Italy, and beyond. With the destruction of the temple, sacrifices and priestly service disappeared. But faith did not disappear. In those years, the Torah, study, and prayer began to take on increasing importance. Instead of a central place located in Jerusalem, local communities emerged, rabbis, teachers. This formed the system that would later be called Rabbinic Judaism. People gathered in synagogues. There, they did not offer sacrifices but read and discussed. They taught their children. They prayed. They searched for ways to preserve what remained. The Talmud appeared, a vast collection of reflections, debates, explanations of the law. It was not just a book. It was a foundation that could be carried to any corner of the world. Thus began a new era. An era without a temple, without a state, without an army. But there was memory, there was the book, and there was inner strength. Thanks to this, the scattered people did not disappear. They became a minority in other countries, but preserved their customs, language, holidays, and faith from generation to generation. After the first waves of exile, Jews settled in various corners of the world. And while in Christian Europe, they often faced persecution, in Muslim countries, especially in the early centuries, their situation was much more stable. When Islam emerged in the 7th century and Muslims rapidly expanded their territories, they brought vast regions under their control, from the Middle East to North Africa and Spain. Along with them, many Jewish communities came under the rule of the caliphates. Islam recognized Jews as people of the book, bearers of an ancient revelation. They were not granted full equality, but they were allowed to live according to their own laws, maintain synagogues, and engage in trade and scholarship. The most vivid example of this coexistence was Jewish life in Muslim Spain. In the region, the Arabs called Al-Andalus. Beginning around the 9th century, Jews lived among Muslims and Christians, freely developed their culture, and even held important positions at court. This era became known as the Golden Age of Jewish life in Spain. In cities such as Ceuta, Granada, Toledo, and Seville, vibrant Jewish communities thrived. Jews were physicians, poets, scholars, and translators. They wrote books in Hebrew and Arabic, studied philosophy, medicine, and mathematics, and translated the works of Aristotle and Plato. Many served as advisors to Muslim rulers and were held in high esteem. One of the most remarkable thinkers of this period was Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, better known as Maimonides. He was born in Sirota in 1135 and displayed extraordinary talent from a young age. Maimonides became not only an outstanding rabbi, but also a physician, philosopher, and scholar. When persecution by religious fanatics began in Spain, his family left the country, and he later settled in Egypt, where he became court physician to the Sultan. Maimonides wrote many works that are still considered foundational in Jewish tradition. His most important philosophical work, The Guide for the Perplexed, was an attempt to explain faith to the rational mind. He sought to show that religion and reason do not contradict each other. In another work, Mishneh Torah, he collected and systematized all of Jewish law. This was a major step toward making the study of the law structured and accessible. Maimonides lived in the Islamic world, but he was respected among both Christians and Muslims. He wrote in Arabic, knew the works of Greek philosophers, and saw knowledge as a path to God. His life demonstrates how it was possible to unite faith, science, and culture in a world that was not always easy, but that offered opportunities for growth. Jewish life in the Muslim world was not always easy. There were periods of violence, expulsion, and restrictions. But compared to what was happening at the time in Christian Europe, where Jews were often expelled or burned at the stake, the Muslim lands remained a place where one could learn, work, pass on knowledge, and build a life. In Christian Europe, Jews found themselves in conditions that were very different from life in the Muslim world. While in the East, they could be physicians, philosophers, and scholars, in Europe, their existence was increasingly marked by isolation, fear, and threat. The medieval Christian Church viewed the Jews as a people who had rejected Christ. They were segregated, restricted, and closely controlled. In many countries, Jews were forbidden to own land, to join craft guilds, or to study at universities. They were pushed out of most professions. At the same time, they were allowed to engage in financial operations, especially money lending, because Christians were forbidden to charge interest. This created a paradox in which Jews were forced into the very occupation for which they were later hated. It led to a constant wave of hostility, especially among the poor and dependent segments of society. Over time, authorities began to relocate Jews into separate areas known as Jewish quarters. The word ghetto would first appear only in Venice in the early 16th century, but the practice had begun earlier. These neighborhoods were often gated and locked at night. They were located in cramped and impoverished areas, but inside those spaces, life thrived. There were synagogues, schools, shops, workshops, and places of study. Life in the ghetto did not mean Jews lived in complete isolation. They had connections with the outside world. They traded, provided medical care, translated books, and at times served local rulers. But every day, they felt they were living in a society not their own, under foreign laws, and always under threat. One of the most terrifying aspects of medieval life was mass accusations. Jewish communities were blamed for the most outrageous crimes, poisoning wells, killing Christian children, desecrating the Holy Host. These accusations had no evidence or logic, but were often taken seriously, especially during times of disaster. The Crusades were an especially dangerous period. In the year 1096, when the First Crusade began, armed mobs on their way to the east attacked Jewish communities in Germany, in Mainz, Worms, and Cologne. People were murdered, families burned inside synagogues, and sacred books destroyed. These events marked the first organized mass pogroms in Christian Europe. Similar violence happened again. During the plague epidemic of the 14th century, Jews were once more accused, this time of poisoning the water supply. In the atmosphere of mass panic and fear, this led to pogroms, expulsions, and the burning of communities. Many Jewish communities in Central Europe were completely wiped out. Some tried to defend themselves, but received no support from the nobility or the church. Starting in the 13th century, waves of expulsions began across Europe. Jews were expelled from England in the year 1290, from France in 1306, from Spain in 1492, and from Portugal shortly afterward. People left homes where they had lived for centuries. They were forced to leave with minimal possessions and start over in other countries where they were still permitted to stay. Yet even in such times, life did not come to a halt. Within the ghettos, learning continued, books were written, new prayers composed. Scholars copied the Talmud, debated points of law. Teachers instructed children, women managed households, sewed clothing, and baked bread. Holidays were celebrated even in the darkest times. Life in Christian Europe was full of threats and fear, but the Jewish people managed to preserve themselves. They preserved their language, their law, their tradition, and passed them on no matter what. After the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of our era, the Jewish world entered a new reality. The center of spiritual life disappeared, the place where sacrifices were offered, the people gathered, and the central rituals were performed. For many, this was not merely a tragedy, but almost the end of faith. Without the temple, without Jerusalem, without priests and altars, how could the commandments now be fulfilled? The search for an answer began among those who would later be called rabbis. These were scholars, experts in scripture, who saw that if sacrifices could no longer be offered, then the focus must shift to something else, to the word, to the law, to learning. This marked the beginning of a transition to a new form of Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism. At the center of this tradition was not a temple or a priest, but a teacher, someone who explained how to live, thought together with students, and responded to questions. The Mishnah was compiled first, a collection of rules, opinions, and decisions on various aspects of life. It did not explain the laws in great detail, but rather recorded the approaches that existed and how they were applied. From about the 2nd to the 5th century of our era, work began on discussing the Mishnah. Scholars in different academies in Judea and in Babylonia commented on every line, debated, gave examples from life, and explored how to apply ancient principles in new circumstances. These reflections took form in the Talmud, a massive text that reads like a living conversation across generations. There are two Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The latter is more complete and systematic and became the main source of Jewish law for centuries. But the Talmud is not just a collection of rules. it is a way of thinking. The goal is not only to find ready answers, but to learn how to think, to understand why one opinion is preferred over another, how the law is connected to life. Rabbinic Judaism is based on the idea that faith is not only prayer and celebration, but also the constant work of the mind. It is a faith that does not fear questions. It does not demand blind submission, but invites learning, discussion, and seeking. That is why every Jewish community had scholars, schools, and synagogues, places not only of prayer, but of study. Over time, some people began to feel that this was not enough, that behind the outward practice of the law there might be something more, a deeper meaning to everything, words, events, even letters. Thus began the development of Kabbalah, a mystical tradition that sought to answer questions such as why the world was created, how the divine is structured, and how a person can touch the mystery. The Kabbalists taught that the Torah does not simply tell a story and give commandments. Behind every word is a layer, and behind every layer another one still. There are levels of meaning that are not visible at first glance. The world is arranged as a system of forces and connections, and even everyday human actions can influence these forces. Every good deed, every word, even every thought, they believed, could shift something in the spiritual structure of the universe. One of the key texts of Kabbalah is the Zohar, a book written in mysterious poetic language, full of symbols and allegories. It appeared in the 13th century, but according to tradition, its content reaches back to the sages of Talmudic times. The Zohar describes how divine light enters our world through 10 levels, called Sephirot. Kabbalists believe that a person who lives consciously can draw closer to this light. Kabbalah was never a mass teaching. It was passed from teacher to student, studied only in mature age, and only after deep familiarity with the Torah and the Talmud. But even if most people did not study it deeply, the very idea that the world is more than what is visible, that it contains hidden harmony, inspired many. Thus, a dual structure of Jewish tradition took shape. On one hand, the rabbinic law, practical and rigorously defined, applicable to daily life. On the other, mystical depth, which does not replace the law, but helps to feel its spiritual essence. And both of these paths lead to the same goal, the search for meaning, connection with God, and living not just correctly, but with awareness. After centuries of life in exile, restrictions, expulsions, and persecution, the Jewish communities of Europe gradually approached a turning point. A process began that would change their status forever: emancipation. Emancipation meant liberation from official restrictions. Until then, Jews almost nowhere held citizenship. They could not own land, serve in government, vote, attend universities, or be equal before the law. Their lives were confined by special legislation, ghettos, and public suspicion. But in the late 18th century, under the influence of Enlightenment philosophy, a new idea began to take shape in Europe, that all people should have equal rights. It did not matter what one believed. What mattered was citizenship. These ideas first became law in France. In the year 1791, French Jews were granted civil rights. They no longer had to live in separate quarters, pay special taxes, or hide their faith. For the first time in many centuries, a Jew could be a doctor, an official, a writer, a deputy, like any other citizen. Over time, other countries followed the same path, at different speeds and with varying degrees of depth. In Germany and Austria, emancipation advanced through reforms and compromises. In Italy, it was closely tied to the unification of the country. In England and the Netherlands, Jews gained equal rights relatively early. But everywhere, it was a gradual and complex process, accompanied by doubts and resistance from parts of society. Many Jews eagerly embraced the new opportunities. They pursued education, participated in science, the economy, and politics. Some fully integrated into society, giving up traditional religious life. Others sought ways to combine faith and modernity. Numerous movements arose, from secular philosophers to reform synagogues. People were searching for their place in a new world. But with the expansion of rights came rising resistance. In the 19th century, a new form of hostility emerged, no longer religious, as in the Middle Ages, but socio-political. This new form was called anti-Semitism. Jews were no longer labeled infidels, as in earlier times, but were accused of other things, of being too successful, of being outsiders, of acting in secret, gaining wealth, and influencing power. This was the time when caricatures, pamphlets, and alleged expos as of Jewish influence began to circulate. One of the most striking and alarming expressions of this new anti-Semitism was the Dreyfus Affair in France. In the year 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, a captain in the French army, was accused of espionage. He was a Jew, and that became the main reason for suspicion. The evidence was questionable, but he was sentenced to life in exile. Society was divided. Some demanded punishment, others called for the case to be reconsidered. The writer Miles Zola published the famous letter, I Accuse, in which he accused the authorities of lying. Eventually, it was revealed that Dreyfus was innocent. He was acquitted, but society had already been changed. The affair exposed how fragile the position of even fully assimilated Jews could be. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, especially in the Russian Empire, the situation was completely different. There, Jews had not received emancipation. They continued to live under strict restrictions. They were allowed to reside only in a designated area, the Pale of Settlement, which included Ukraine, Belarus, parts of Poland, and Lithuania. Travel beyond it, access to universities, government jobs, all of this was either forbidden or tightly controlled. Jews could not own land, were often not permitted to settle in villages, and even within towns faced limitations. On top of this was everyday hatred, fueled by both governmental and religious institutions. In times of social crisis, economic hardship, or political unrest, Jews became convenient targets. In the year 1881, after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, a wave of pogroms swept across the empire. Mobs attacked Jewish quarters, smashing windows, looting shops, burning homes and synagogues, beating and killing people. The authorities almost never intervened, and sometimes even encouraged the violence. One of the most tragic events was the Kishinev pogrom in the year 1903. In just a few days, dozens were killed, hundreds injured, and hundreds of homes destroyed. Newspapers around the world reported it with horror, but in the Russian Empire, there was almost no official response. On the contrary, in the following years, the pogroms continued. This was a frightening sign. Jews realized they could not count on protection from the state. This led to mass emigration. From the late 19th century, millions of Jews left Eastern Europe. Some went to the United States, some to Britain, others to Palestine. People were not seeking wealth, they were seeking safety. They simply wanted to live in a place where they could work, study, and pray without fear. While some Jews were fighting for civil rights and trying to integrate into European society, changes were also taking place within the Jewish communities themselves. Faith, tradition, religious life, all of this was evolving. Some sought ways of renewal, others a return to spiritual roots. This gave rise to two major movements, Hasidism and Reform Judaism. Hasidism emerged in Eastern Europe in the mid-18th century. Its founder is considered to be Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, known as the Baal Shem Tov. He lived in poor Jewish villages, spoke with ordinary people, and taught that serving God was possible, not only through study and strict rules, but also through joy, singing, and heartfelt prayer. He taught that every action could be holy if done with sincerity. Hasidism quickly spread among the common people. It brought comfort, inner strength, and faith that God was near, not only in books, but here in life. Communities formed around charismatic leaders known as tzaddikim. These leaders did not only teach, they also advised, helped, and inspired. Hasidism became not just a movement, but a way of life, with its own traditions, clothing, music, holidays, and prayers. But not everyone welcomed Hasidism. Talmudic scholars, representatives of a more strict and rational approach, accused the Hasidim of straying from traditional law. This gave rise to internal conflicts that lasted for decades. Over time, however, Hasidism became one of the most resilient and influential forms of religious life in Eastern Europe. At the same time, in Western Europe, a very different movement emerged, Reform Judaism. It began in the early 19th century in Germany, at a time when Jews were gaining rights and becoming part of secular society. Young, educated Jews were asking, can faith be preserved without rejecting the modern world? Reformers proposed changing many elements, conducting services in the local language as well as Hebrew, shortening prayer times, removing rituals that seemed outdated. They said the moral meaning was what mattered most, not strict adherence to every detail. The Torah was not just law, but an idea that must be understood in the spirit of the times. Reform Judaism became popular among those who wanted to be both Jewish and full citizens of their countries. Soon, the movement spread to the United States, where it later gave rise to conservative and liberal branches. But in traditional circles, Reform Judaism was viewed with concern, as a departure from the law, as an attempt to dissolve faith into the surrounding world. And so, by the end of the 19th century, the Jewish world had become even more diverse. Some followed the path of tradition, others sought renewal, others still tried to preserve inner unity. But all increasingly felt that even with rights and education, even with reforms and integration, Jews remained other in the eyes of the majority. This feeling became sharper against the backdrop of pogroms, the press, and political hostility. It was in this context that a new idea began to take shape, the idea of returning to their own land. Its leading voice was Theodor Herzl, a Viennese journalist, playwright, and lawyer. He was not particularly religious, but he was shaken by the Dreyfus affair in France. He saw that even in the most enlightened country in Europe, a Jew could become the target of hatred simply for being a Jew. Herzl came to the conclusion that Jews would never truly be free until they had their own country, not a ghetto, not a temporary refuge, but their own land, where they would not be a minority but a nation. In the year 1896, he published a book titled The Jewish State. In it, he proposed the idea of political Zionism, a movement to establish a national home for the Jewish people. In the year 1897, in the Swiss city of Basel, the first Zionist Congress was held. Delegates came from many countries, religious and secular, Eastern and Western. They argued, debated, but most importantly, they agreed. Herzl articulated the goal to create for the Jewish people in Palestine a publicly recognized home under international law. This Congress marked the beginning of the organized Zionist movement. Funds were established, fundraising began, plans were discussed for resettlement, agricultural development, and the building of schools. It all seemed like a dream, distant and nearly impossible, but it gave people hope. After the first Zionist Congress, the idea of the return of Jews to Palestine was no longer seen merely as a dream, but as a plan that could be put into action. Although Herzl died young and did not live to see many of the events that followed, his ideas found support among thousands of people, especially in Eastern Europe. It was from there that the first waves of Jewish immigration, known as Aliyah, began. The first Aliyah had actually started before Herzl, in the year 1882. Most of its participants were Jews from the Russian Empire, fleeing pogroms, poverty, and severe discrimination. These were people without political programs, but with a strong belief that a new, free life could begin on the land of their ancestors. They founded agricultural settlements, attempted to cultivate grapes, olives, and grain. The conditions were extremely harsh: the climate, disease, and lack of infrastructure. Many settlers could not endure and left, but some stayed, and that was only the beginning. The second Aliyah began in the year 1904 and lasted for about a decade. Among the newcomers were not only religious people, but also those driven by ideology, mostly young people inspired by socialism and national revival. They did not just want to survive. They wanted to build a new Jewish world, free from humiliation, based on labor and justice. It was they who created the first kibbutzim, agricultural communes where everything was shared. They revived Hebrew as a spoken language. They built schools, launched newspapers, and staged plays. During this same period, Jews encountered complex relations with the local Arab population. They purchased land from large Arab landowners, but this often led to resentment from the local peasants who lived and worked there. Although the early years included examples of peaceful coexistence, tensions rose as the number of Jewish settlers increased. The situation changed dramatically after the First World War. The Ottoman Empire, which had included Palestine, collapsed. These lands came under British control. At that moment, one of the most significant events in the history of the Zionist movement took place. In the year 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent an official letter to Lord Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. The letter stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine and would assist in its realization. This became known as the Balfour Declaration. Despite its cautious wording, it was the first official recognition by a major power of the Jewish right to a homeland. For the Zionists, it was a crucial step, but for the Arab population of Palestine, it was a cause for alarm. They were the majority and did not welcome the arrival of another people with political ambitions. In the year 1920, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern Palestine. This began a period that lasted until the year 1948, known as Mandatory Palestine. Britain was tasked with supporting the establishment of a Jewish national home while also respecting the rights of all inhabitants, including Arabs. In practice, this proved nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Jewish immigration continued. The third Aliyah began after the year 1919. This wave included Jews from post-war Europe and from Russia, escaping the Civil War. Many were young, educated, and determined to build a new life from scratch. They established new settlements, expanded kibbutzim, and strengthened infrastructure. In the year 1925, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem was founded. Economic cooperatives, labor unions, and cultural institutions gradually emerged. In the year 1924, the fourth Aliyah began, mainly from Poland. Many of these immigrants were small traders, artisans, and middle-class families. They became the foundation of Jewish urban life in Palestine. New neighborhoods, workshops, and shops appeared. The economy grew, but so did the conflicts. The year 1929 was especially tragic. It saw Arab pogroms in Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safed. In Hebron, dozens of Jews were killed, some of whom had lived there for centuries in close contact with Arabs. The massacre shocked the entire Jewish community. It became clear that the problem was not just dissatisfaction, but a deep, growing hostility. In the 1930s, the fifth Aliyah began. After Hitler came to power in Germany, waves of Jewish refugees poured into Palestine. They were fleeing Nazism, repression, and the loss of civil rights. Alongside them came doctors, engineers, architects, musicians, people who enriched the country's culture and economy. But as the number of settlers grew, so did the anger of the Arab population. The British began to restrict immigration, especially after the year 1936, when a large-scale Arab revolt broke out in Palestine. The Mandate authorities found themselves caught between two peoples. They tried to appease both sides, and in the end, satisfied neither. For the Jews, this was a time of building and struggle. Underground defense organizations emerged: Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi. They fought first against Arab groups, then against the British. Meanwhile, institutions of the future state were taking shape. A tax system was introduced, emergency medical services were created, schools and agriculture developed. By the start of the Second World War, the Jewish population in Palestine exceeded 400,000 people. And although the future remained uncertain, the idea of independence was no longer just a dream. It had become a matter of time and cost. After the horror of the Second World War and the Holocaust, when Nazi Germany carried out the systematic extermination of approximately 6 million Jews in gas chambers, in mass shootings, in death camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek, the Jewish people found themselves in a state of deep trauma and loss. Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, which for centuries had been centers of Jewish culture, scholarship, and tradition, were completely wiped out. The Holocaust was the culmination of Nazi ideology, which since the early 1930s had been built on the idea of racial purity and portrayed Jews as an existential threat to the German people. The final solution to the Jewish question meant not merely deportation, but the physical destruction of all Jews in Europe. After the war, hundreds of thousands of survivors were left without a homeland, without families, without citizenship. Displaced persons camps became their temporary refuge. It was during these years that the idea of returning to the historical homeland gained a new urgency. Now, it was not only an idea of restoration, but of rescue. In this context, and amid the dissolution of the British Empire, the question of Palestine's future became central to international politics. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Partition Plan. Palestine was to be divided into a Jewish and an Arab state, and Jerusalem was to be placed under international administration. The Jewish Agency, representing the Jewish population of Palestine, accepted the plan, even though the proposed borders were complex. The Arabs rejected it. They did not recognize the Jews' right to statehood and considered the division unjust. On May 14, 1948, on the eve of the end of the British Mandate, David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence. At that moment, Israel was surrounded by hostile countries with numerically superior armies. On May 15, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Transjordan, which would become Jordan, declared war on Israel. The First Arab-Israeli War began. Despite heavy losses and a lack of heavy weaponry, Israel managed to hold its ground and even expanded its territory in several areas compared to the original United Nations plan. The war ended in 1949 with a series of armistices but no peace treaty. As a result, the issue of Palestinian refugees emerged. Around 700,000 Arabs left the territory of Israel. Their status remained unresolved and became one of the core problems of the conflict. The following decades became a series of wars, crises, and diplomatic efforts. In 1956, Israel participated in a joint operation with France and Britain against Egypt. After Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Israel occupied the Sinai Peninsula. However, under international pressure, it was forced to withdraw in exchange for guarantees of freedom of navigation through the Straits of Tiran. In 1967, tensions escalated to a peak. Egypt blocked access to the Red Sea, concentrated troops on the border, and Syria and Jordan entered into a military alliance. In response, Israel launched a preemptive strike, beginning the Six-Day War. In just a few days, Israel defeated the armies of 3 countries and took control of Sinai, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. It was a triumph, but also a deeply complex achievement. Israel became the occupier of territories with millions of Palestinians, leading to a protracted conflict, diplomatic isolation, and ongoing violence. The next major war, the Yom Kippur War, began on October 6, 1973, on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack. In the early days, Israel suffered severe losses. The army was unprepared. Only thanks to mobilization and United States assistance was the advance halted, a counteroffensive launched, and Egyptian forces encircled. Despite military success, Israel experienced a profound psychological shock. It became clear that even military strength could not guarantee security. This turning point paved the way for peace. In 1979, the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab country, Egypt, was signed. Under the agreement, Israel returned Sinai, and Egypt recognized the Jewish state. Later, in 1994, a similar agreement was signed with Jordan. But with the Palestinians, the issue remained unresolved. After the Second World War and the Holocaust, the Jewish diaspora did not simply change, it was reborn. The traditional centers of Jewish life in Eastern Europe were destroyed. From Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Hungary, Germany, places where millions of Jews had lived for centuries, only the remnants of communities remained, destroyed synagogues and memorial plaques. Those who survived either could not or did not want to stay where their families had perished. Most chose the path of emigration to Israel, the United States, Canada, Latin America, Australia. Thus, a new Jewish world began to take shape. In foreign policy, Israel holds an important, though complex, position. Since its establishment, it has remained closely tied to the United States, receiving not only political, but also military support. In recent years, Israel has strengthened its ties with China, India, countries in Africa, and South America. Particularly notable is the normalization of relations with several Arab states, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. These agreements, known as the Abraham Accords, open new opportunities for trade, tourism, and security. However, the Palestinian issue remains unresolved. Israel continues to face international criticism, especially regarding settlements, the status of Jerusalem, and the blockade of Gaza. In this way, the modern Jewish world is a network that spans the entire globe. It is New York and Paris, Moscow and Buenos Aires, Jerusalem and Los Angeles. It is people who speak English, Hebrew, French, Russian, but are united by a shared history, culture, and memory. The most populous center of Jewish life after the war became the United States of America. By the early 1960s, around 5 million Jews lived there. It was a diverse community, including people from Eastern Europe, immigrants from Germany, descendants of Sephardim, Holocaust refugees, and later Jews from the Soviet Union and Iran. American Jewry absorbed a spirit of freedom and civic engagement. Powerful communal institutions, charitable organizations, synagogues of all denominations, university departments, and cultural centers emerged. Jews became prominent in politics, media, law, finance, art, and science. At the same time, there are many views within the community on what it means to be Jewish, ranging from Orthodox movements to entirely secular and cultural identities. The United States also became an important source of support for Israel, financial, political, and ideological. The connection between American Jewish organizations and the State of Israel remains key for both sides. In Europe, the situation is more complicated. After the war, many Jews left the continent. However, some remain, especially in Western European countries. In the post-war years, communities began to revive in Paris, London, Amsterdam, Brussels, Berlin, Budapest. New synagogues, schools, publishing houses, and museums were opened. The Sephardic community in France became especially strong, as large numbers of Jews from Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco arrived during the 1950s and 60s. But Jews in Europe live in a state of ambivalence. On the one hand, they are officially protected, have access to resources, education, and cultural opportunities. On the other hand, they face rising anti-Semitism, acts of violence, especially from radical groups. In recent decades, calls to leave Europe for Israel have become more frequent, especially after the terrorist attacks in Toulouse, Paris, Brussels. Despite this, Jewish life in Europe remains active and diverse, particularly in education, culture, and memorial efforts. In the post-Soviet space, Jewish history underwent a century of dramatic change. In pre-revolutionary Russia, Jews were confined to the Pale of Settlement and subjected to discrimination, yet maintained a rich cultural and religious life. In the Soviet Union, a process of erasing traditional identity began. Jewish schools were closed, synagogues placed under surveillance, Judaism pushed out of public life. But starting in the late 1980s, a revival began. In Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and other countries, Jewish schools, cultural centers, and youth organizations appeared. Restored synagogues opened in Moscow, Kyiv, Minsk. Major charitable foundations were established. At the same time, a huge portion of Soviet Jews emigrated to Israel, Germany, the United States, Canada. This emigration became one of the largest in history. Those who remained continued to develop communal life, though numbers are declining and assimilation remains high. Against this backdrop, Israel became not only a geographic center, but a symbolic one. It is a state that welcomed millions of returnees, endured wars, crises, internal divisions, and yet built one of the most dynamically developing economies in the world. Today, Israel is a high-tech nation. Its GDP per capita is comparable to that of developed European countries. It is home to some of the best universities in the Middle East, powerful research institutions, medical centers, and startup incubators. Israel is a leader in cybersecurity, agricultural and water technologies, biomedicine, and artificial intelligence. Many Israeli innovations are used around the world, from desalination plants to security software for banks and governments. Throughout the 20th century, Jews made an enormous contribution to the development of science, culture, and philosophy. Many of the most brilliant and influential thinkers, scientists, and artists were Jewish, not because they belonged to some closed intellectual circle, but because Jewish tradition had for centuries instilled respect for knowledge, reflection, reading, discussion, and the search for meaning. One of the most recognizable symbols of this contribution was Albert Einstein, a man whose name became synonymous with genius. Born in Germany to a Jewish family, he became not only a remarkable physicist who revolutionized the understanding of space and time, but also a public intellectual, a refugee from Nazism, a pacifist, and a supporter of the idea of a Jewish state. He was offered the presidency of Israel after the death of Chaim Weizmann, but declined, saying he could serve humanity better as a scientist. His contribution to physics, humanism, and Jewish history remains inexhaustible. Equally important in the field of the humanities was Sigmund Freud, a Viennese physician and founder of psychoanalysis. He not only changed the understanding of the human mind, but also influenced art, literature, cinema, and philosophy. His Jewish background played a significant role in his life, as he faced discrimination but never abandoned his identity, even when he was forced to flee Austria after the Anschluss and emigrate to London. In the 20th century, Jews found themselves at the center of cultural life, from avant-garde literature to popular culture. One of the most influential filmmakers of our time, Steven Spielberg, is an American of Jewish descent. He not only made legendary films, but also played a major role in preserving the memory of the Holocaust by creating the Shoah Foundation, which collected testimonies from survivors. His film Schindler's List became both an artistic and moral statement that helped millions view the tragedy of the 20th century in a new light. Jewish writers, musicians, painters, philosophers, and journalists left their mark in all areas of culture, from Franz Kafka and Isaac Bashevis Singer to Marc Chagall, from Bob Dylan to Leonard Cohen, from Hannah Arendt to Arthur Miller. Today, the Jewish people, despite being scattered and diverse, continue to shape global culture. But alongside this come new challenges. One of them is the rise of anti-Semitism. In the 21st century, despite the horrors of the Holocaust, attacks, desecration of synagogues, and online hate campaigns are once again a reality. In Europe, the United States, and even some Latin American countries, prejudice and stereotypes are on the rise. Conspiracy theories are spreading on the internet, repeating old yet dangerous myths about global Jewish influence. In response, initiatives have emerged promoting education, protecting communities, and enacting hate crime laws. But the threat remains. Another challenge is assimilation. Especially in Western countries, where Jews live freely and openly, there is the danger of a gradual loss of identity. Fewer people speak Hebrew or Yiddish. Fewer observe traditions or pass on religious and cultural knowledge. Mixed marriages are becoming the norm. In response, new forms of Jewish education, summer camps, youth programs, and internet initiatives have been created to try to unite modernity and tradition. But it is a difficult struggle between freedom of choice and the preservation of uniqueness.